Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Aneri. He's widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts on Ukraine. He's currently a professor of international relations and formerly served as provost and executive vice chancellor at the University of California at Riverside. A Fulbright scholar, he earned his bachelor's degree in international relations from Michigan State and a master's degree and a PhD from Cornell. His research focuses on Ukrainian domestic policies and Ukraine's relationship with Russia. He's the author of numerous books, and in early 2013, he was one of the first researchers to examine the corrupt activities of longtime Republican operative Paul Manafort. Remember that crony? When Manafort was working in Ukraine. Manafort, as you probably all recall, then became Donald Trump's presidential campaign chair. And then he committed a lot of crimes, and he went to jail only to be pardoned or commuted his sentence by Donald Trump. Well, our speaker today is a scholar who has the expertise on Ukraine with his extensive personal experience of the country and its people, and he's been an eyewitness to Ukraine's courageous struggle for independence and freedom and from the domination of Vladimir Putin, what he's seeking to impose there. And I don't know, Doctor, are you in Ukraine or are you back here in the States?
Fortunately for me, I'm in Riverside.
Okay, well,
I want to know. I want to know from Mayor Villaraigosa if Riverside's one of the places getting the money.
yeah. Well, I guess it's safer in Riverside than Ukraine. So please welcome Dr. Paul Aneri.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Paul Aneri. I teach political science at UC Riverside, and I have been studying Ukraine and its relations with Russia since the early 90s. I've been to Ukraine more times than I can count, including just last week. It came back just last week from a trip. And so I'll talk a little bit later on about specifically what I saw when I was there. But let me begin to talk in a big picture about why this war is happening, what I think the sources of the war are, because I think that connects then to questions about how we might think about ending the war, which then, of course, connects to U.S. Policy towards ending the war, because even with the interesting role that the U.S. is playing, it still potentially or almost certainly does have a role to play. People always want simple explanations for things like this war, and I always prefer nuanced ones. It's why I write, I wrote a book about the causes of this war that's, I don't know, 210 pages long or something like that. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I like nuanced explanations because, in particular, I think when we base foreign policy on simplistic explanations, like we have sometimes done in the past in this country, we often end up in disaster. So it's important to understand some of the details as well as the big picture. In this case, it turns out, despite everything I've just said, that we can provide a fairly simple explanation of the war in Ukraine that does not do too much violence to the facts or does not oversimplify things in a way that's too dangerous. And I'm going to give you that simple explanation, but I'm also going to try to talk briefly enough to allow you plenty of time to ask questions. So the simple explanation is this. This goes back to 1990, 1991, when the Soviet Union was starting to collapse and then collapsing. And the short way to put it is this. Russia never accepted the loss of Ukraine. Leaders, we think of pro-Western leaders, people like Boris Yeltsin, his foreign minister at the time, a guy named Andrei Kozyrev. These were the pro-Westerners. But if you go back and read what they wrote, which of course I did and quote in my book, they wanted to be close to the West. They wanted to get rid of communism. They wanted to reform Russia, but their idea of Russia did not include giving up Ukraine. In fact, the coup that led to Gorbachev losing power and the Soviet Union coming apart in August of 1991 was a coup that was thrown to prevent the signing of a new version of the Union Treaty, which was going to give more autonomy to all of the republics, including Ukraine. And so as far back as August 1991, you had so the sort of right wing in Russia willing to throw a coup against their own government in order to prevent this treaty from being signed, while the Ukrainians were saying this gives too much authority to the center. We want to go further. So the basic conflict, in a way, has been there since 1991. Now, and as I said, Russian liberals have pretty much always said this, including a more recent sort of hero of the Russian liberals, Alexei Navalny, have basically said, oh, Ukraine's really Russia. What we saw for the last 35 years or so is Russia trying a whole range of means of bringing Ukraine back under its control, ranging from let's just be patient, they can't hack it on their own, they'll beg to come back in, to let's turn off the supply of gas in the middle of the winter, and when they're freezing, they'll ask to come back in, to we'll spur dissent among Russian-speaking people in particular regions and push secession if they don't come back in, and so on. None of that worked. Even seizing Crimea and seizing a chunk of the part of eastern Ukraine we call the Donbass in 2014 did not get the Ukrainians to say, okay, we'll make a deal to come into some big trade agreement with you that you'll eventually use to bring us back in. And so when I wrote the first edition of my book about the war in 2019, I said in the conclusion that it's clear now, right, 5 years after the invasion of 2014, that the only way Russia is going to get Ukraine is going to be to conquer it militarily. And I think most of us hoped and or believed that faced with that choice, full-scale war or accept Ukraine's independence, we thought and we hoped that Russia would accept Ukraine's independence. That perspective, among other things, was based on the idea that Vladimir Putin is conservative and risk averse. And in the end, he turned out not to be so conservative and not so risk averse. He really was willing to risk very high stakes in order to accomplish something that I think he came to see as his historical role. So Putin is a part of the explanation because while I think it's true that almost all Russians took it for granted that Ukraine should be part of Russia and that we would love to get it back, I don't think it's the case that all Russians or even all Russian elites would have started this war. And so I think Putin and his personality and his sort of determination to play the role of the great man in history does, and his view, by the way, that this would help his popularity at home, that this constitutes part of the cause as well. So with that very broad, oversimplistic sense of how the war started, let me talk a little bit about where we are now. Russia and Ukraine have been fighting for just shy of 4 years now in this all-out war, but of course they were fighting for 10 years or 8 years previous to that. The front lines in the conflict have largely stabilized. Russia is making very incremental gains in the part of Ukraine we call the Donbass, towards claiming that entire region as its own, which is one of Putin's primary, or what he says is one of his primary war goals. That effort to get a few hundred meters of territory here and a kilometer there is costing the Russian military roughly 30,000 soldiers a month. And so in many respects, this is now a war of attrition. And the question is, can Russia, which has something like 3 times the population of Ukraine, can its larger industrial base and larger population, but the fact that it's got to fight in another country, essentially can that overwhelm the Ukrainians' will to fight? Meanwhile, of course, well, I would just say that one more thing about the situation now. So Russia is throwing men, usually with only a few weeks training, right? New recruits get a few weeks training and a big signing bonus. They go into Ukraine and thousands of them are being killed or wounded. And they're capturing some territory. And the question is sort of from the Russian side, how long is that politically sustainable? Right? The question on the Ukrainian side is how long is it sustainable for them to replace their own losses while at the same time Russia is bombarding cities and focusing on taking out heating plants in the middle of winter. So that is sort of the background for negotiations. But I would say, just as a way of summarizing, um, absent some dramatic change, and wars sometimes do have dramatic changes, but absent some dramatic change, it seems like both sides can do what they're doing now for quite some time to come. It doesn't seem very likely that a massive breakthrough in either direction on the battlefield is likely. This is just a competition to see who can inflict more suffering and who can withstand more suffering. Um, that's at least the case, unless, again, something dramatic changes. So there are peace negotiations underway now, and we know more about the Ukrainian side than we do the Russian side. The Ukrainians clearly would like to see the war end. They're struggling and they're suffering, and they are worried that they can't do this forever. There's no doubt about that. And so there are basically, I would say, four main issues. One is the territorial distribution. Ukraine basically has said, we'll let Russia keep the territory it's already conquered because we don't have a way of getting it back, but we're not going to give it any more territory. Russia has insisted, and from what we can tell, we don't know for sure, but from what we can tell, the Trump administration has, at least privately with Putin, has endorsed the Russian position to say that Russia should get a whole bunch more Ukrainian territory, so it would get total control of this region called Donetsk. So that's the first issue, is territory, and from what we can tell, that's the biggest sticking point. A second big issue is whether Ukraine will be neutral after the war, which Russia has insisted on, and which the Ukrainians generally regard as basically just creating a situation where Ukraine will be vulnerable until the next time Russia decides to attack. So related to then this question of neutrality is a question of what kind of security guarantees Ukraine would receive and from whom they would receive them in order to sign on to a peace agreement. And then lastly and that's a huge question that has to do with NATO and has to do with other European actors maybe giving some kind of guarantees, because it doesn't seem like NATO is going to. And there are huge problems with those other kind of guarantees, because it's really NATO that has the military capacity to do something, right? Not the Polish army or the German army by itself. And so security guarantees that aren't NATO guarantees don't seem to be worth very much. But NATO doesn't seem to be on the table either from the NATO side or to be acceptable to Russia. And then the last question is post-war armaments for Ukraine. Well, if Ukraine isn't going to be able to get really reliable security guarantees that it can count on, right, then it will need to protect its security by having a powerful military. And that means building lots of weapons and creating lots of weapons, or buying lots of weapons. And Russia insists on numerical limits on the Ukrainian armed forces, limits on the kind of weapons they can have, and limits on what the West will provide them. So despite all the talk you hear about negotiations, I think they're actually quite far apart. In my personal view, and I know some other people who share this view, my personal view is that these negotiations are not very serious. They're more about, Russia is trying to create the PR that says they want peace. The Trump administration is trying to create the PR that says they want peace. The Ukrainians are trying to reassure the Trump administration that they want peace and are willing to make concessions because they feel they need to reassure the Americans of that in order to get the Americans to keep on supplying them with the weapons that they need. So let me talk a little bit more about the role that the U.S. Plays, which I think has gotten quite ambiguous, partly because the United States elite is a little bit divided on this. What used to be called the mainstream on foreign policy in this country is heavily supportive of Ukraine. That's true of, I would say, the mainstream of the Democratic Party and the mainstream of the Republican Party. Extreme leftists tend to be sympathetic to Russia. Extreme rightists, interestingly, also tend to be sympathetic to Russia, and both extremes tend to be more isolationist. Currently, however, it's the extreme right that controls the White House and is making policy. And I think, would be doing more to harm Ukraine or less to help Ukraine if it weren't for the sort of traditional foreign policy hawks in the Republican Party. That's my estimation of the U.S. politics. Excuse me. Although not for the first time, I will stress I'm more of an expert on Russia and Ukraine than I am on the U.S. So I was in Ukraine really for only a few days at the very beginning of February. So just 2 weeks ago, really. And I was in a city in the west called Lviv, where I lived for a year back in the 90s and have a lot of friends. And then I spent about 3 or 4 days in Kiev, the capital. And while I was there, this was during this period where the Russians had bombed all the central heating facilities for the city of Kiev. It's a strange thing, and we don't have the same thing here, but essentially in Ukraine, and this was true in the whole Soviet Union, they have these big central heating plants that then push steam and hot water that will heat all the buildings of a single city. So it's like a radiator system, but instead of having a boiler in your basement, you have a few big boilers for the whole city. And the Russians have been bombing these. And so I talked to a friend of mine who said, it's 50 degrees in my apartment, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It never got above about 8 degrees Fahrenheit the whole time I was there. So people are really cold, right? Like living your life every day, every night in a 50-degree apartment gets old really, really fast. I was just there for a few days, and I can't imagine doing that for months. There were also a lot of blackouts. But the takeaway from my perspective is the Ukrainians are absolutely taking this in their stride. And I'll just tell one anecdote real quickly. So I went out to meet a friend of mine. This was on a Saturday morning. We went out to a cafe, and people are out in the cafes on a Saturday morning in Kiev. Everybody's got an app on their phone that tells them when an air raid is coming, and they know where to go. But we were just drinking coffee, and all of a sudden, all the power goes out. And so it's like, wow, the power went out. Nobody seems to blink an eye. Somebody walks from the back of the cafe. A guy drags a generator out onto the sidewalk and fires up the generator and runs the plug back into the cafe. And a woman comes out from behind the counter with a couple of little battery packs and just plugs in a few little lights around the place just so that there's a little bit more light in the cafe, and everybody goes back to normal. And the power did not come back. That was about 9 o'clock in the morning. Power didn't come back in Kiev that night until sometime around 6 o'clock. But everybody has either bought what they call an accumulator. It's basically a big power source, a big battery, and they charge them when the power's on, and then they use them when the power's off to do the few things they need to do. And they put extra blankets on their bed. But the long and the short of it is, I couldn't find anybody who said, we can't take this anymore. We have to make more concessions for peace. Quite the opposite. What they said was, if the Russians think this is going to get us to cave in, they have no idea, right? We will do this as long as it takes. And I think that is there's actually survey data showing the same thing, that there is about 30% of people surveyed in Ukraine say we would be willing to give up more territory in order for peace. But most of the rest basically say no. We'll keep doing this as long as we need to. So yeah, that's a lot of what I could tell you based on having just been there. And again, I can just tell you, walking around Kiev, it's a pain people are cold, and it's cold outside, but they essentially are doing everything they can just to live their lives. One other thing I would tell you is I talked to a former student of mine, and she must be just about 50. And I said, oh, what's going on? How are things going? And she said, well, my husband's off at the war, right? And one of the things that's interesting in Ukraine is there are many people in their 30s and 40s and 50s who volunteer and are fighting at the front, which is something we really don't have in this country, right? We have officers and generals who are in their 50s, but certainly not enlisted people. So Lewis asked me to say a little bit to connect what's going on in Ukraine with what's happening in the U.S. And so let me do that real quickly, and then I'll stop. Stressing again that I'm not a specialist on U.S. politics. Two things, really. One is Ukraine is crucial to the future of U.S. foreign policy, both philosophically, because Ukraine is really where we're having the debate about whether the United States is going to continue to play the same kind of role in Europe that it's played since 1939 or 1940 or 1945. And substantively, if Ukraine is ultimately defeated by Russia, I think it will usher in a whole new era in international politics of changing borders by force that would begin to look more like 19th century colonialism. And we got a taste of this, right, with this whole thing about taking over Greenland. And we got a taste of it with the takeover of Venezuela. with the crucial difference that this is not the 19th century, it's the 21st century. We've got globalized economies, a globalized information space, and of course, rapidly proliferating nuclear weapons. And so I should say that one of the things I think will come as a result of this war, especially if Ukraine is allowed to be crushed, is we'll see countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Asia, Germany and Poland in Europe probably pursuing their own nuclear weapons. The last thing I would say then is while it's clear that U.S. is incredibly important to Ukraine, it's also the case that Ukraine is important for the United States. And we saw that with the first Trump impeachment. And in the huge amount that certain Ukrainian oligarchs were willing to spend on a guy called Hunter Biden just because he was the son of the vice president of the United States. Ukraine is kind of a canary in the coal mine for the U.S. in terms of it's a good example. If you look at Ukraine before the war, it's a good example of what happens when old-fashioned machine politics, the kind I grew up with in Albany, New York, where we had the same mayor for 40 years, when those old-fashioned machine politics threatened to take over an entire country. In Ukraine, they twice had to have major street protests to prevent this or to overthrow it, once in 2004 and then once in 2014. Those national level machine politics not only increase corruption, but undermine sovereignty because there's always somebody outside the country who wants to use that corruption to undermine the country's national interest or its sovereignty or simply control its policies. In both the case of Ukraine and the United States, this means Russia, but for the United States, it means a lot of other countries and other actors as well, who, to the extent that politics becomes about extorting money from people, will be happy to contribute the money needed to get the policies they want. So I will stop there, and I will be happy to take whatever questions you all have.
Okay, we have a few questions. Fraser, right up front. Let's wait for the mic so they can hear you.
Paul, thank you very much for that. I have two questions. I have heard reports that Ukraine is having trouble with internal corruption and also recruitment of new soldiers to face the Russians. Can you comment on those things?
Yep. Corruption has been an issue in Ukraine for as long as I've been going to Ukraine, studying Ukraine, which is over 30 years. I think it's very important that those of us who find ourselves advocating for Ukraine, that we don't pretend that it's not there. It's there. It's equally important that we don't overestimate it, especially when we look around at some of the things that happens in our own towns and cities and country. By which I mean, Ukraine is not exotic in this respect. It's more than I think we see here, but it's the same kind of stuff, right? It's especially the same kind of stuff that we see currently in the U.S. federal government, but again, which we sort of took for granted where I grew up in upstate New York. Certainly they took for granted in Chicago for many, many years, and maybe still, I don't know Chicago. So yeah, it's there and it's a problem, especially during war. But they've also got some new institutions in place, especially a new like independent anti-corruption prosecutor. This is intended to sort of play the role that the FBI played with organized crime in the 1940s, something totally independent, uncorruptible that can begin to do something about this. And I don't think we're going to know exactly how that's going to work until the war ends. But the other question is about recruitment. Absolutely. It is a problem. The Ukrainians, they're almost the opposite of us in that they don't want to conscript anybody under the age of 25. Whereas in the United States, the age of conscription ends at 26. And I asked them about this because to me, it's so different. And they basically said, this is our youth. This is our future, right? These are the people we don't want dying. So far, they've been able to hold it together. But I think everybody understands that they will need to find more people to fight as the Russians kill more people. And I think part of Putin's strategy is, even if I'm losing 30,000 men a month, his idea is that the Ukrainians will run out of troops before he does. We'll see. But that is the contest.
I have a question over here.
One, I want to thank you very much for what you're doing by sharing the story. I wanted to know a little bit more about the war strategy of distraction. We seem to be getting more involved with other things, uh, putting them in front of something that is really core. The other one I wanted to ask you about Timothy Snyder and United 24. And I also wanted to ask you what you believe to be credible news places that we can find out more. I've been following in Reuters, I've been following in The Economist and also The Atlantic. But if you can recommend any other sources, credible sources, I'd really be appreciated that.
Okay, you asked a couple of different questions, and so make sure I get to all of them. There was one about Tim Snyder. There was one about reliable sources. What was the first one? Oh, about distraction. Yes. So so communications and misinformation, and this has been a crucial part of Russian strategy from the get-go. And by the get-go, I mean going back certainly to the end of the Soviet era, but also during the Soviet era. So one of the ways in which Russia won a lot of early battles in this war was creating this narrative that Ukraine was always part of Russia and always should be part of Russia. Another way in which Russia played one important early information victories was the idea that they were attacking Ukraine to prevent NATO expansion. And as I've sort of tried to show, Russia was saying it wanted to get Ukraine back long before there was ever any NATO expansion. So it's hard to see how the second thing caused the first thing. But yeah, it is. I think that's what's going on with these negotiations. Frankly, I think they are a very deliberate distraction from what's actually happening, which is some fairly brutal stuff. Putin does not want people talking about atrocities. He does not want people talking about Ukrainian kids getting kidnapped from their parents and sent to Russia for re-education, war crimes, genocide. He wants us to be talking about NATO, right? And of course, the same thing for the Trump administration. They are extremely good, right? The pace with which the Trump administration creates crises or creates things for everybody's head explode about, it's obviously quite deliberate, and it's unfortunately effective. Tim Snyder, I know Tim Snyder as an historian. The project that you're referring to, I got to say, I'm not familiar with. But he's an absolute first-rate historian of that region, and more recently has become what we would call a public intellectual, particularly his book about tyranny and freedom. And he's somebody that I think a lot of people look up to. But I know him first and foremost as a great historian. And where do I get my information from? The ones you mentioned aren't bad. I remember something that the head of HBO said, and it must be 20 years ago now. And he was talking about entertainment, not news, but you'll get the point. He said if you're not paying for your television, you're not the consumer, you're the product. And I would say that's probably true of our news. If we're not paying for our news, we're the product. That is, our eyeballs are being fed to the advertisers because that's how they're making their money. And so there's a couple things that I pay for. I pay for the New York Times. Far from perfect. Sometimes absolutely irritates me. But their international reporting still tends to be quite good. And I think their national reporting is quite good. I also pay for The Economist. The Economist, for those of you who don't know it, is a weekly news magazine from the United Kingdom. And it is written, I think, at a very high level. It's intended to be read by business leaders, political leaders, college-educated people. And because it comes from London, you get a different perspective on things. Its ideology is liberal in the European sense, which is sort of not the same as liberal in the US sense. But I think both of those are pretty good. The Financial Times from London is also quite good. Yeah, those are the ones I rely on the most. I also read some Ukrainian and some Russian stuff to get an idea of what they're saying, not as reliable news, but as a sense of what's getting said in different places. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, we got a couple questions.
Hi. Could this have ended a couple years ago if Biden had given Zelensky everything he wanted?
I think the short answer is yes. I think the tragedy of American strategy in this war, as in some others over the last 50 or 60 or 70 years, has been incrementalism. And I'll just give you one example in this war. Is, before this war started, before the full-scale invasion, the Ukrainians asked for all kinds of hardware, and we gave them very little. But even with the very little we gave them, right, they gave this enormous bloody nose to the Russians in the early days of the war. There was a lot of talk for a long time about this missile system called HIMARS, these extremely accurate long-range artillery systems. And after 6 months of hemming and hawing, we finally gave them very small numbers, and they took out a whole lot of Russian command posts, basically taking out a lot of Russian commanders that could not be replaced. But the Ukrainians didn't have that many of them, and so they ran out, and then the Russians just moved everything further away. And so, sort of a one-time opportunity to totally wipe out the sort of Russian kind of battalion and division level military leadership was lost. And so the answer is yes. And we could say that, I mean, I think we should be fairly critical of the Obama administration, of the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, as well as the second Trump administration.
Paul, it's Lewis with a point of privilege because I'm holding the microphone. Question for you. We've spoken about the war, the Ukrainian war as being an existential crisis for Ukrainian democracy. To what extent is it an existential crisis to the future of Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Putin is one of the great mysteries in this, in that we don't have a lot of access to him. Let's just put it that way. So anything we say about Putin is a little bit speculative. It reminds me of my very early days as a graduate student when, the Soviets were still in power and we were looking at pictures in Pravda to see who was standing next to whom. I think there's a good case to be made, and a lot of people would argue this, that Putin cannot afford to lose this war. I think there's an important sense in which that's true. I think the question I have related to that is exactly what is it that he could pitch as a victory, right? If the war were to end tomorrow with the boundaries where they are, could Putin claim victory enough, right, so that he would survive it? And I tend to think yes, but I understand that he's worried about it and he's more cautious than I am. So part of it is he's worried about the Russian right wing coming after him. And I think part of it is he's worried about his role in history.
Question here.
He has this Peter the Great fixation.
Okay, next question.
I just have a question. I was watching the German defense minister on TV, and he was saying the Germans are gearing up for 2029. And I was wondering if you envision where American troops would have to fight in Eastern Europe if the Russians are successful.
Well, this is largely what's at stake in this war. On the one hand, right, a lot of people kind of on the isolationist side of things are saying, let's stay very far clear of this because we don't want to fight a war in Central Europe, right? We don't want to be fighting with the Russians. There's another school of thought that says, of course, the best way to not have a fight with the Russians, right, is to not let them think that having gobbled up Ukraine, they can then go gobble up some NATO allies. We can debate that because we don't know, we can't get inside the Russians' minds and know exactly what's likely to make them more or less likely to attack. But this is the issue. The issue is the U.S. strategy since 1945 has been a robust U.S. presence in Europe. The argument being that the more robust the U.S. presence in Europe is, the less likely it is that we'll ever have to be used in combat. And so during the Cold War, there was always this concern that the Russians would attack West Germany from East Germany because they would think the Americans are not going to go to nuclear war with us over Germany. It's just not worth it to them. And so the way we always dealt with that was by building this NATO integrated operational command and by having a whole lot of U.S. forces actually stationed in West Germany in places that if the Soviets invaded Germany, West Germany, they would actually have to kill Americans in the process. This idea was sometimes called the plate glass window, right? They couldn't just do something a little. They'd have to kill a bunch of Americans. So this gets into deterrence theory. I could bore you for a long time talking about deterrence theory. But that is what's now at stake, is what is the strategy of the United States and for the Western Europeans to deter and prevent a possible Russian invasion of Western Europe. Now, there are people who are going to say, you don't need to worry about it. The Russians have a fixation on Ukraine. They no longer have a fixation with Poland or Germany or anything else. Just let them have Ukraine and they'll be happy. That is impossible to disprove. I'm not sure I would want to bet the future of world security on it.
I think we
I hope I've answered your question.
Carol?
Well, I've been very impressed with the type of technology, drone technology that has come out of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And, clearly they have a lot to offer. And, how much can that help them? I think it has helped them in the past. How much can it continue to help them that they seem to be so tech savvy and able to do a lot with a little?
Yeah, it's a great point. So much of the conversation is about, what
Thanks.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So much of the conversation's been about what NATO can do for Ukraine. It's increasingly clear that Ukraine has a lot to teach NATO. And I'll just tell you one thing, one anecdote, which is I just read about this yesterday or the day before. Just recently, there was a NATO war game simulation done, and they basically brought in a bunch of Ukrainian drone forces, not the forces themselves, but the operators, because it was a tabletop game. But basically, they had them play the red team, the bad guys, against a NATO division, and essentially wiped out the NATO units very, very quickly. The point being that NATO units at this point in time are not at all ready to deal with drone warfare on the battlefield the way it's emerged between Ukraine and Russia. And obviously, the Ukrainians can help both with the technology of this, and the drones themselves, but also with the tactics and training and everything else. So yeah, this is a big part of the story, is the adaptability of the Ukrainian armed forces and the speed with which you think about American defense procurement, where it takes about 3 decades, it seems, to build a new widget. The speed with which the Ukrainians are seeing needs, building gadgets, and deploying them out in the field is incredible.
All right. Well, okay, go ahead. We have one question online. And go ahead, Reggie. Oh, okay. George Lewis has got the question. Go ahead, George. Are you with us?
I can see the question that it seems like somebody, G. Lewis, asked in the chat. Do you want me to read it and answer it?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it says, what caused the Minsk Accords to fail? And had they succeeded, would this war have been avoided? It's a good question. The problem is a good answer is a very long one, so I'm going to oversimplify. I think the Minsk agreements were doomed from the beginning because they didn't deal with any of the serious issues. So go back to fall of 2014, Russia had invaded eastern Ukraine. Russia had invaded eastern Ukraine in the summer of 2014, and the Ukrainians actually were doing a pretty good job rounding up and beating up on these sort of special force units. Then in the late summer, Russia invaded with the regular army, and the Ukrainians were getting routed, and they were kind of desperate. And Germany and France and Russia sort of pushed the Ukrainians to accept this Minsk agreement, which had this is my view, not the Ukrainians. I think, well, the Ukrainians, I think, would agree with me, but they might not say so publicly. Had they implemented everything that was in that agreement, it would have made Ukraine's future independence very difficult to sustain, which I think is exactly why Russia supported those agreements. Germany and France supported them because they just wanted the war to stop so they could keep on buying gas from Russia and not have anything disrupt their economic relationship or create political problems in Europe. So the Ukrainians signed those agreements because they had to, because their allies were telling them to, and because they were losing on the battlefield. but they always were there was always a fight about what implementing them meant. So the Russians said you have to do it this way. The Ukrainians said no, we have to do it that way. If we do it the Russians' way, Ukraine will cease to exist. And so they didn't really solve the underlying problems. But what happened over those 8 years between 2014 and 2022 is the Ukrainians got used to the idea that they didn't have control of that eastern slice of territory and they didn't have Crimea. And they wouldn't say this publicly, but what they basically said was, we can live with this, right? We can live with this because in the meantime, right, by doing what he's done, Putin has totally unified Ukraine, right? And that's part of the big story that we haven't talked about is the whole premise for Putin invading Ukraine was this idea that Ukraine's not a real society, it's not a real state, it's not a real people, it's not a real nation. And whatever you think about that before the invasion, it's certainly not true now because Putin has done more than anybody in history in a way to unify the Ukrainians. And I think once he realized what had happened after 2014, that the Ukrainians were never going to implement Minsk on the Russians' terms, he said, well, I'm going to have to do something else then. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Danieri, for your unique perspective. I mean, we received information from you that we could get from nowhere else. And thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and perspective.